All right, shalom, friends, shalom, and thank you for being here on the program with me today. Blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Of course, this is not an episode of Unapologetics, actually, nor is it an episode of The Watchdog, though I guess it does sort of fit under the umbrella that is my Watchdog podcast. We're going to have a discussion today, actually, with gentlemen, many of you actually may know I've actually been on his podcast before, Michael, the Canadian Atheist. I'll be introducing him here in just a second. He's just in the back room with me. And yeah, I just wanted to let you guys know about that, let you know what's going on here as far as the conversation. So before we get into that, a couple things I wanted to announce as far as channel announcements. Really cool things actually developing. So thing number one, some of you guys may have seen April 15th, 8 o'clock a.m. Mountain Time. I will be interviewing David Roll, the founder of the New Chronology, the Egyptologist, and also the main scholarly voice behind the Patterns of Evidence documentary. He'll be here for at least an hour. It may end up being longer than that, but nonetheless, that is actually going to occur here on April the 15th, this month, of course, and that is going to be 8 a.m. Mountain Time, so 10 a.m. For those of you who are on Eastern. And, of course, everybody else, I'm sure, can figure it out. I know most of the people who watch this are on Eastern, though, so I just wanted to throw that out there. And that's, of course, going to be like a really, really cool thing, all things considered. That might actually be the biggest thing I've ever personally done. I have debated Dr. Richard Carrier, so I don't want to say that's definitively the biggest thing I've ever done. But I'm very thankful for it, and I appreciate Dr. David Roll's time. And if any of you guys are interested in that, please do be sure to check up on that. Also, self-same week, hopefully, not as confirmed on this one yet, but it seems like it's going to be confirmed. We're going to try and also have an interview with the church historian Bruce Gore on the exact same topic, namely because Bruce Gore, though he wouldn't be debating Dr. Roll's positions per se, he does have a different opinion on when the Exodus occurred and all that sort of stuff, right? So Dr. David Roll takes the New Chronology, which revises Egyptian chronology. Bruce Gore takes conventional chronology, and both do agree the Exodus happened, but I want to provide both sides there. Not in, again, a debate format, but just interviewing each of the two. So we'll probably have Bruce Gore on here as well. And then the last thing I wanted to announce, just to remind you guys, the only thing we're waiting on right now to get this second channel started, which, by the way, this video you're watching is going to end up being my sort of first, I guess, promo video for that, if you will. The only thing we're waiting on is my intro. I got to get a logo set up. I have a buddy of mine working on the logo. And then as soon as I got that, I got another buddy of mine who's going to set up a brief intro, and then we're going to be good to go. And hopefully that'll be sooner than later, but that's why we've been kind of slacking on Watchdogs, not having that up as much. And I hope that you guys are, I guess, not troubled by that at all. I mean, I know there's been big news that I've been missing that I haven't been commenting on. Obviously, there's the Derek Chauvin trial. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of stuff developing over in the Middle East with Pope Francis and his Israeli deals. Obviously, there's the Israeli elections to talk about, and I have just been not on any of that, so I apologize for all that kind of stuff. But that's all we got for announcements. The question that I have for us today is diversity good? You can rephrase that if you like to helpful, beneficial, make us stronger, whatever you'd like to put it out, right? Good's a pretty general term to use. By the way, shalom, Jeremy Martin. Thank you for being here in the chat. This discussion that we're going to have is a result of a tweet that I made earlier today, where I was looking at, and I don't even really remember the context that they were talking about. I'll have to look up the article again, but a bunch of commenters talking about, diversity this and diversity that on Twitter. And I kind of just wanted to have a hot take. And so I posted, I think diversity is, what exactly I said is diversity is stupid and meaningless. And even though that was put in a sort of provocative manner, like even though I was kind of trying to push buttons a little bit, I do actually believe that. Now, I want to quickly clarify what I mean by that. That does not mean diversity is bad. I am not taking the position that diversity is bad. And in fact, the term stupid, it's more that it's not that diversity itself is stupid as much as it is that I think people who put a bunch of stock in diversity, I wouldn't say they're stupid, of course. I just would say that I don't think that that is a logical thing, right? And of course, Michael is going to try to defend that today. And so we'll see just how wrong I may or may not be. But the second part is the part I really hammer home, which is that I do believe diversity is meaningless. I don't think it ultimately creates benefit or negativity, right? I think it's just sort of a thing that happens sometimes. Sometimes religious diversity, sometimes ethnic diversity, sometimes racial diversity. It doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't really matter. Sometimes it even appears to be bad. Sometimes it appears to be good. And the reason it appears to be both of those things, in my view, is because it's not relevant. It's a correlation without a causation, right? And so that's basically my point. That's the brief little point that I wanted to put forward. I have Michael, the Canadian Atheist, here with me, and I want him to, of course, be able to lay out his point. I obviously just took up like 6 minutes, so I'm going to give him as much time as he needs to lay out why he thinks that this is a good conversation to be having, introduce himself, all that kind of stuff. I'm also very happy to have you here, Michael. We've had 2 conversations so far in the past, but both of them were really solid. So hoping this will be another good solid one.
Oh, I have no doubt. First, CJ, thanks for having me on. This was an incredibly impromptu thing. For everyone who does watch this live and who is watching it later, it was quite literally, I saw the tweet. I'm like, we found a point of disagreement. And 30 minutes later, here we are. So I do take the contrary position. For the purposes of this discussion. It's not going to be a debate, obviously, but I do take the contrary position. I think that, it'll be super simple and super fast. I think diversity is there you are. I think diversity is a very good thing for lots of different reasons. And it was funny because the first thing I was thinking to myself afterwards, I'm like, well, I read that. I'm like, diversity meaningless. And I'm like, well, he obviously doesn't mean like diversity, like in the simplest term, like, I have a diversity in terms of like, boxes of cereal in my cupboard. Of course he means more than that, right? As I'm kind of juggling this thing around in my head. And but and you touched on that, whether it be racial or ethnic, which I think are almost the same thing. Sex, gender, those types of things, age. I can only see that as a good thing, depending on what table we're sitting at and what discussion we're having. I think the diversity matters more in some forums than others. And I don't think I need to say anything more than that for us to get into a discussion about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think the elephant that sort of exists in the room, because it's the thing most people I think immediately have to their mind when we talk about diversity in the modern day, is probably racial diversity. And so I think that would be the first thing that would be good for us to jump into, just because I'm more than sure it's the first thing on most of the audience's mind.
I think you're probably right. And who better to discuss racial diversity than 2 white guys?
That is a good point.
So, I say it, of course, tongue in cheek, because there, if you wanted to have, more in-depth and meaningful conversations, you could probably put a panel together. Mm-hmm. And if you ever decided to do that, I'd be all into being a portion of that as well. But I think you are right in that in 2021, when you say diversity, there are probably a couple. Like, I think race is probably close to the top of the list. Gender or gender identity is probably right up there too. Socioeconomic as well is probably close to the top. But yeah. But anyway, do you want to talk about race first? Like, that's fine.
Yeah, well, and so just to get it out of the way almost, because I just feel like that's the first one that people would. And the thing is, too, is I think part of the reason it's the first one that people come to is because it's the one that people are kind of like, well, I hope that's not what they mean, kind of thing, right? In other words, people start to, they kind of, I think they hear certain things and they almost want to, well, I certainly hope this isn't what you mean. And so that's part of the reason I think it first, comes to their mind. And I will say, sort of just to get that part out of the way, I do not believe that there is any sort of a benefit to like lack of racial diversity. I do believe there are incredibly extreme circumstances, which I have never actually lived in, where certain cultures hate each other so much that it might be best that they split. But that tends to be more of a cultural thing to me than a racial thing. If the two cultures happen to be different colors, that just is more luck of the draw than anything else. But as far as like actual Like, but on the flip side, though, and I guess this is what gets to my point, I don't know what the benefit necessarily is of having racial diversity either. Like, in other words, it just seems like a thing that happens. It doesn't seem like there's a good or a bad to it. If there was, say, me and you and Jesus is Lord, Jill, right, who's obviously African-American, and Leophilius, who's also African-American, just to give, that's also 2 atheists, 2 Christian. Sure. It just, I don't see how the conversation could be, by that fact alone, expanded. It might be expanded because of the 2 people we chose, Leophilius and Jill. It might be expanded because of maybe even some of the experiences they might have had in their own lives. But like the sole fact that we now have 2 black guys and 2 white guys talking, it just seems to me to almost be moot.
Okay, so one of the first things that I want to say is I'm reminded of something Christopher Hitchens said in one of his discussions once. He said, one of the things we have to get over is this stupid concept of race. And he expanded on that to basically say, that we're all members of the human race. And I think that there's value in that. But you hit the nail right on the head in that. So if you put if you put a group of ethnically diverse people together in one room, then it can be entirely arbitrary until you start talking about stuff. And it is wholly, I think, dependent on the topic, right? The same as if you had, for example, and I'm sure we'll get into this, if you have a bunch of, for example, in the world, most lawmakers are men.
Right.
And when those lawmakers get together and start to make laws that impact everyone, including women or other gender identities, that can be problematic. And that's where I think diversity is important. So if we just put a pin in that for a second and go back to race for a moment, it entirely depends on what it is you're talking about. Are we making policies? Are we talking about treatment by law enforcement, things like that? That's where diversity does become important. So in one sense, I'll completely agree with you in that it's completely arbitrary to have a bunch of different people together until you start talking about something. And there may be things like if you're talking about your favorite baseball team or ice cream flavor or things like that, who cares? But if you're talking about things that do have relevance, that do have importance, that's where it becomes important to hear different voices. Because, like with the example that you mentioned with Leo and Jill, you and myself, we're all going to bring different experiences. You and I have no clue what it means to be a black man. Zero zilch. I grew up in an incredibly non-diverse neighborhood. I actually, on the flip side, in the neighborhood that I grew up in, I grew up pretty poor. We were one of only 3 white families of about 600. And so it was the reverse. And I'm not saying I had any type of hardship because of that, because I still had the unbelievable privilege of being white. But it was different. And so it's those life experiences that we can't relate to. It doesn't matter how many books we read. It doesn't even matter how many people we talk to or how many people share their experiences with us. We'll never have that. We'll never be able to get the grit of their experience. And that's why in a conversation like that, there's no substitute for diversity.
Well, I could certainly see that, like, where, for example, if you were to have like a police brutality question, and especially if you were to have like a panel, right?
Sure.
It might be a good idea to maybe you have maybe even more than one black person who's been in a poor area, more than one white person in a poor area, and then have 2 like middle class, upper class, and see like, all right, can we find out, is this stronger in middle classes? Is it stronger in lower classes, but specifically on a racial line? Sure. And that kind of thing. And that's certainly, there is value to that. Absolutely. Even in just a straight statistical sense. Right. But so now let's I guess taking that example itself, right? When you have everybody there discussing these things, you do have the different examples of experience, right?
Mhm.
Or the different, I said that right, examples of experience. But now when it comes to actually, looking at the things itself, the problems, right? You present that to, are you a Bernie Sanders fan?
It's interesting you asked that question. Yes, I am. But I'll put an asterisk on that, saying that I'm a liberal voter here in Canada. We have three parties, and I had this discussion with a couple of other Americans. So we have the Conservative Party, which is the GOP. We have the Liberal Party, which is the Democrats, and we have the NDP, or the New Democratic Party. And if Bernie was Canadian, he'd be head of the NDP. Okay, best way to describe it. Yeah. I typically lean more liberal, which is not. It's not as weird a stretch. Like the GOP seems to be like pretty hardcore right. And then you have people like Biden, who's the Democrat, but it's really kind of like centrist, almost right leaning. And then you have the Democrats, which are in some ways touted as this massively leftist party. And I watch it with almost chuckles most of the times, because if a GOP member thought that the Democrats were crazy leftists, what would they do if they saw some of the policies from the NDP in Canada? Like they'd probably they'd fall right out of their chairs.
Right.
So that's a very long-winded answer to your question of yes.
Well, and so the reason I asked is, so like now you take this problem, police brutality, right?
Sure.
You present this problem now to a Bernie Sanders, right? A relatively, at least middle class throughout his whole life, but now decently wealthy.
Oh, sure.
Old and white Jewish man, right? Yep. Who's got little to nothing in common, culturally or racially speaking, with what you would expect from somebody from either the West Coast or the Deep South, which is where you're going to find the largest majority. Although I guess there'd probably be a good deal of African Americans in like New York, that area too. So, but the inner city areas basically, right?
Sure. Okay.
And yet, does that mean that his decisions on these now? And to be fair, I personally would not agree with his opinions on this, but that's irrelevant. With in your view, I mean, he's not discounted now, right? Because he lacks all that diversity. He's actually, right? He's in fact the exact opposite of what you would expect from that. But sure, he still has like the right opinion in your view. You know what I mean?
So the difference is, so the reason why a political example of this is bad, just for lack of a better term, is because politicians aren't, with the exception of your former ridiculous in chief, aren't insular, right? It's the people, largely. It's like, it's like if you look at a politician and someone who becomes president, yes, they have the capacity for executive orders, and they can push their agenda, but they also tend to surround themselves with people, and they tend to surround themselves with like-minded people. So you have the capacity to have one person who's I would go as far as to say Bernie's probably, I mean, he's not elitist rich, but he's at minimum upper middle class, bare minimum upper middle class. I think what his net worth was something like $750,000 or something like that. When the taxes came out 4 years ago, like it was something like that. So, I mean, that's not, that's more than my wife and I, but it's not, it's not Jeff Bezos. Right. So I'd say upper middle class. So there's immediately a problem of the ability to relate. One, because he's an old white guy, Jewish. I'm not sure that plays a huge part in it, but whatever, old white Jewish guy. But he's going to surround himself with people, like he has the capacity and the willingness to surround himself with diversity, so he can get those different opinions, because I think he would be the first one to say, I have no idea what it's like to be black. right? Just like I did a few minutes ago, and just like I think if anyone white or non-black is being honest with themselves, they'll say it too. I'm reminded of something Justin Trudeau, our current prime minister, said in I believe it was 2015, when he put his cabinet together. His cabinet was at probably 60% female and probably 80% non-white. And he was asked during a press conference, like basically there's a thing where he's there and his entire cabinet's standing with him, right? And they're like, and one reporter was like, Justin, can you explain, can you give us an explanation as to the degree of diversity? And I think it was diversity he said in his question in your cabinet. And Justin Trudeau just looked in the camera and said, because it's 2015.
Well,
and just moved on to the next question. Right.
And I do see that in that, like, it's not, I see that answer being relevant in that the question to me seems irrelevant, right? In other words, like if I had some Republican who agrees with everything I did politically, and 14 of his 15 cabinet members and the vice president all happen to be non-white, I'm not bothered by that. You know what I mean? Because we're past the age of segregation and racism and stuff like that. But what I would be bothered by is if he had 14 out of 15 non-white people specifically for that reason, because it seems to me now we've left meritocracy and gone towards something that is seemingly arbitrary. It could potentially give us some benefit, but it doesn't necessarily so, right? Just that, like, the fact that I don't know Canadian politicians' names, so I'll have to use some of my own, right? But if I have like a Ted Cruz who's Hispanic and a Ben Carson who is black and a Rand Paul who is white, right? I do like all three of those people. I think they would be very like a good team with each other, right? But if that's the only reason that they're picked, it seems kind of arbitrary to me. Like it's almost like we got lucky that there are three people who happen to agree with me strongly, not that there are three people who agree with me strongly and that you know what I mean? Like in one example,
I understand completely what you mean, and this is where I think that it's interesting. My wife and I have had strong conversations about this kind of thing. There is there does exist now a I want to say requirement, but because I'm not in these different fields, I can't say that with any degree of knowledge. But it appears from the outside that there seems to be a preferred recipe of content for certain things. So if you're going to have a political cabinet, you should have a degree of diversity. If you're going to have a teaching staff, you should have a degree of diversity. If you're going to have whatever, there should be a degree of diversity. And my wife and I were chatting about this, and I said I believe that there are places where that should not be the case. And she looked at me and she's like what? And I said, well, like firefighters, for example. I said the criteria from my perspective, again, I only play one on TV. I'm not a firefighter. If the criteria for me for a firefighter is being able to drag my ass out of a building. If you can pick me up and drag me out of a building, you got the job. If you can't do that, I don't care how you identify from a gender perspective. I don't care how tall you are. I don't care what biological sex you were born with. I don't care anything about that. You can't have the job because you can't do the job. The same as if you hire a computer program and they need to be able to program in Python. If they can't program in Python, I'm sorry, you don't meet the criteria for the job. You can't have the job. So I do think there are areas where a lack of diversity is not a slam or a slight or being exclusionary in any way, shape, or form. Now, if you can have, in a perfect world, if you had 25 people that were applying for this firefighter job, for example, and there were 25 people applying, and there was a broad degree of diversity. But of those 25 people, they all met that minimum criteria, right? They can all drag me out of a building. So they're all qualified to do the job, even though there's way more to being a firefighter than that, obviously. But they meet the criteria. And then you look at the rest of the firefighter population, and it's all white guys around 35 years old. Do I think then it's important to inject a degree of diversity? Sure. For the same reason why if you had a political system with a whole bunch of qualified people, it's good to inject a degree of diversity, because even if all it does is give you the ability to, in certain situations, have a different point of view, I can't see how that's negative. Now, I understand we're talking about these ideal circumstances, which probably aren't very realistic. But
yeah, and I think one of the biggest problems with it really is, I mean, I know, there's a lot to be said about culture and a lot to be said about economics, but honestly, even just bigger than those is just straight up population, right? Like if the African, Hispanic, and Caucasian populations in America, at least, are all the same, like equal levels of like educated and prosperous and in different fields, well, there's 62% of this country is white, so it would still be, relatively speaking, like a huge majority on one end.
Oh yeah, it would be. I think the percentage. The last time I looked, I think the percentage of the U.S. population that was black was something like 17%.
Yeah, it is pretty small. It's larger than it once was for sure, but it is pretty small.
And I could be off. It just, that number seems to be in my head as the last time I saw a number for it. And there might be some that argue, well, if you're only 17% of the population, then should you only have 17% representation? I don't know. I don't think so. Because then I think it comes down to, like, if you take the same firefighter analogy, and it's like if all of the people, like if we flipped everything around and it was all of the people who met that criteria were all black people, sorry, but a black person's going to get the job because they're the only ones that are qualified for it, right?
Yeah, well, and there's even there's like a lot of, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's fine. No, it's fine. It's fine. It's your show, man.
Well, and there are, I appreciate that, by the way. There are some real world examples of that though, right? Where we have like farming, for example. Farming, not just in the States, but I'm sure it's a problem in Canada. It seems to be a problem in Europe. It's definitely a problem even in Africa. There's just not an awful lot of black farmers in the world for some reason. They just don't appear to be as interested. And I think it has a lot to do with culture, personally. It doesn't appear to me that a lot of African cultures farmed as much. They definitely had like pastoral communities for sure, but not like the grain and all that. It appears they were more interested in the cattle and the animals like that. I could just be wrong about that. I'm not an expert on African history or culture by any stretch.
I've lived in urban areas my entire life. I can't say anything intelligent about what the racial breakdown is of farmers. I can't comment intelligently about it.
Well, and that is one thing in particular. I will admit I do have a little bit of an advantage on, just because I did grow up most of my life in Nevada, but from about 14 up, I've been in Idaho. And farming is
potato country, that's right.
Yeah, it's like something like 50 to, or not 50. It's close to 50 though % of our economy is farming based. It's a huge industry here. In fact, I do live in the suburbs. I can take just a mile walk and get to a farm, which is probably really weird for people to think of, like, really, from the suburbs? And it's like, yeah, and I can take a mile walk and get to the city too. Like, we're really that close. And it's just, at least now in Idaho, it's even worse than it is in the rest of the country. In Idaho, I have never met a single black farmer. I have met Hispanic farmers, but for the most part, they're primarily white. That has a lot to do with just the racial demographics of the state. There's not a lot of black people here in general. But nationally speaking, and again, even globally speaking, there does appear to be this long-standing problem of very, very small amount of black farmers. White farmers, plenty. Hispanic farmers, plenty. Chinese farmers, plenty. But for some reason, there seems to be a small amount of black farmers, right?
Yeah, I got nothing when it comes to black farmers.
Well, and I'm not saying anything about the fact that they're not there in general, as much as I am. That does seem to be like a real world example of, and what I would say is probably a cultural thing. Also, probably has a little bit to do with lack of land ownership. That over time. Right, exactly. And so over time, it's just been the most qualified people are for that particular job are just typically not African American people, and they're also typically not interested in it, right? But there's nothing wrong with it inherently, like just because that is the facts.
Oh no, there's nothing wrong with it. But something that just I just thought of is it could have something to do with the and you touched on this, but the lack of ethnic diversity within some of these farming areas. And from an outsider's perspective, when you have these insular communities, they probably wouldn't be too accepting of outsiders who look like outsiders. Like I could probably move to your town and not have any problems. That probably isn't the case for someone who's black. And that is a total assumption on my part. Maybe your community is unbelievably welcoming, but from what I see in the media, when the heartland isn't that welcoming of people who aren't white.
Well, believe it or not, actually, it's not racially. It's not a big problem in Idaho. They tend to be pretty accepting that way. It's actually a state thing. Idahoans, Wyoming, people in this sort of upper Pacific area, but the heartland sort of it part, not Oregon, Washington, very hostile towards West Coasters.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, it's actually I've talked about it for a lot. It's something that I fear may get bigger than people give it credit for, because it sounds so ridiculous, because we're all Americans, right? And it's like, oh, you got to talk to people where people do not think that way.
I think there's a massive amount of Americans who don't look at all Americans as Americans.
Yeah, for sure.
and you don't have the market cornered on that, because there's plenty of racism in Canada as well, systemic and otherwise. So yeah, that's you certainly don't have. I don't want to seem like I'm bashing America. I do sometimes, but mostly because of healthcare. But
but being a Canadian, you do have a example. I tell me if I'm wrong, but with Quebec, right? Of like where it's like it's not necessarily racial; it's more like a provincial, right? Like we don't like.
It's very. Yeah, no, that's very cultural. So long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, there was a referendum. I don't know how old you are, CJ, but this was in the early 90s, and there was a referendum in Quebec to secede from Canada.
Oh wow!
And it was 51-49 for them to stay in.
Wow.
Yeah, and like they wanted their whole distinct culture and all that other stuff. And there are parts of Quebec that are beautiful. Quebec City's spectacular. Montreal's amazing. I've not visited. Hull is quite nice as well. So people who are familiar with it will know it. Other be like, what? But yeah, there's actually in Quebec there's a city called Quebec City. But anyway, they wanted their whole distinct society thing. I was really, and I'm still mad about this. 2 decades later, because the situation, I don't want to get too crazy into Canadian politics, but basically what Quebec wanted was the equivalent of living in your parents' basement. They wanted all the support of the Canadian federal government.
Right.
They wanted all these other things, but they didn't want, but they still wanted to be a separate society. They still wanted an international border with that. And, so it would be the same as, like if Canada and the US were one country and Canada separated, but Washington still sent us money.
Right.
So it was maddening for a lot of Canadians, and there are still hardcore separatists. In fact, there's another. I didn't mention this because they're kind of a fringe party, but in Quebec there's the Parti Québécois, who are still hardcore separatists. Like they want to separate all the time, and it's always about what's in this for Quebec, and how do we get out of this place. And it's hard because the prime minister, trying to hold the country together while they're constantly trying to pull themselves apart. Right? It would be the same. There's been chatting of what if California ever broke away? Texas threatens to do it every 3 days or something like that.
Literally.
So it's distressing for for someone who loves the country. And there were these bumper stickers and pins and stuff like that. So my Canada includes Quebec and stuff like that. It was a big deal. It was a big deal.
And that was just to answer the brief question. Just I am 22, so that was a little bit.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's a little before your time. But, my daughter's older than you.
Oh wow! I didn't really. I honestly didn't think that you were that much older than me.
I'll be 50 next month.
Oh, you actually, I'm not gonna lie, you look good for a 50-year-old.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, that's so. Then you'd have a very probably even more real example than what I experience here in Idaho, as far as like this cross-state dislike. Racially speaking, it doesn't appear to be too big a deal. I have heard in the northern parts of Idaho it's worse, but I live in the southern, so I don't know.
The U.S. perplexes me for lots of reasons. For example, if in Canada, if there's federal law, it's federal law.
Right.
A province has the capacity to establish a more strict law. So let's say, for example, that they wanted to reinstitute, just some law, just pick a law.
Right.
And became a federal law. Ontario, for example, could make a law that was even more restrictive, but they could not lessen the restrictions. If a law is federal law, that's it. So when everybody say states' rights, it's just like, what do you mean states' rights? But then I have to remember that you're not a democracy, right? You're not a true democracy. It's a democratic republic.
Right. And also another thing that I think a lot of people forget as far as the United States is concerned is the idea of a nation that is America. And by that, what I mean specifically is a federal government. Americans usually, especially conservative Americans and older Americans also, even if they are liberal, they tend to look at America almost as the group. And then there's America, the government. And a good example to sort of give people is almost the Book of Judges, where you have all the tribes and they're all Israelites, but they're also kind of all doing their own thing. And sometimes the judge shows up and controls all of them, but sometimes they don't. And that's really the way a lot of Americans think. And the thing is it was actually worse in the past. I won't go too deep into it just because it'll derail the conversation. But before our own Civil War here, a big portion of the reason why a lot of people fought for the groups that they fought for, like everybody often asks, so, like Stonewall Jackson, right? The man was willing to pre-war violate the law by holding Sunday school services for slaves so that he could teach them how to read and write and learn the Bible, which could have got him dishonorably discharged and potentially even executed. And yet he fought for the South. Why? That doesn't make any sense. Well, because he fought for Virginia is what it was. He thought Virginia was his country, so to speak. You know what I mean? And the Civil War, the end of the Civil War is, in my view at least, and in the view of a lot of American historians too, the beginning, not the fruition, but literally the beginning of people starting to actually see America as a true identity. And even now, 160 years later, that's still not a common thing. There's a lot of people. I'm an Idahoan, a Wyomingan, or whatever. You know what I mean? I mean, Texas, obviously, you brought it up, right? It threatens secession once every 3 days. I mean, Texas does not even consider themselves truthfully American, honestly. I mean, and a lot of times you can even ask them, and they'll be straight up with it. Like there's a party in Texas, Texas Nationalist Party, that even, I mean, at one point they even kidnapped some people and started like threatening to go to war. It was only in the 90s. Of course, that was before I was actually born, but I'd read about it. I think they called themselves the Republic of Texas at that point, but nonetheless.
What's the next thing sorry.
Yeah,
it's probably my fault we got dragged away. But what's the next thing you wanted to? I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure that we're in that much disagreement.
Definitely not on the racial one for sure. But I think this is a good opportunity to move into another one, which is, I think, cultural diversity, considering that it is sort of what we're talking about with the states in a way.
Sure.
Now, cultural diversity, I think, has very often created benefits for sure. As an example, obviously, you just take the names Ford, Carnegie, and Rockefeller. And clearly those three families came from three different areas of the world. They were all Europe, right? But Carnegie is European. Ford is, I believe that sounds to me like it's English. And Rockefeller sounds very German. Now, I could be wrong about those exact things. I know Carnegie is definitely going to be in the Scottish or Irish area because that's actually where he was born. But nonetheless, definitely different areas, right? And yet they all came to the same country. And as a result of the diversity that was allowed in this country, ethnic diversity in that case, or cultural, whichever word you'd like to use, this country got the benefit of all three of those titans of industry, right?
Sure.
It's obviously a positive. On the flip side, though, we did just spend some time talking about a pretty hefty negative with cultural diversity, which is this, like, people don't, like, why does the Quebecer, in his own mind at least, have loyalty to the rest of Canada? Why does the Texan feel he has loyalty to the rest of the United States? A lot of times they don't. And they just feel like, no, I'm part of my culture. Those other guys truly are other guys, right? They're the other, in other words, to just abuse that word. And I'm not sure whether or not, I don't think that there's one that's worse than the other, but I don't think that the benefit is so great that the negative can be said to not like balance it out almost to be moot. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, but and yeah, so we're gonna disagree on this again. But so one of the things that I love, Toronto. So Toronto's the fourth largest city in North America. I'm just east of Toronto, but I still, people say, where do you live? I live in Toronto, because if I say I live in Whitby, they're like, huh? So Toronto's the fourth largest city in North America. The greater Toronto area is about 7.5-ish million people, and the unbelievable cultural diversity and what's now called cultural diversity, which used to be called multiculturalism. Right. That was a big button. That was a big button name when I was growing up, and everything's multicultural. And now cultural diversity has kind of taken over, which I don't care. I mean, tomato. Right. I'm thrilled. I love the fact that I can, like, to someone who lives here, I can say, let's go to, let's have some great Italian food. We'll go to Dufferin and St. Clair, and you're instantly transported in your brain to, that's, and it's known as Little Italy. Mm-hmm. And there are these pockets of diversity, and it spreads out. They're not wholly insular. There are some pockets within the city of Toronto proper that are insular. But you can find it almost anywhere. And and maybe 10 minutes from there, there's an Ethiopian restaurant called Addis Ababa. Well, it's, I guess an obvious name, but right. I can have, Ethiopian cuisine, or I can have Italian cuisine, or I can drive another 5 minutes and have, some unbelievable, Chinese food or some sushi. And so that's one of the things that I think of, which is probably why I'm fat. But why I love this idea of cultural diversity, but it also allows me to see some other things, like Toronto has, they'll have a Diwali festival every year, and there's we have Caravana, which is a massive Caribbean festival, and of course nothing happened last year. But Toronto's famous for some of these festivals that they have, where they just, like, the community just open arms and they invite everybody in to experience their culture, whether it be clothing, food, music, traditions, all these other different types of things. And it's from an educational perspective, the fact that I could take my, that I could take my daughter when she was younger to things like that and allow her to experience those types of things, and then in June, I could take her to Pride festivities too, because Toronto has the second largest Pride parade in North America, second only to San Francisco. So there's just this diversity, again, even if only from an educational perspective, and allowing you to sample these other cultures, just adds to the richness of my life experiences here.
Well, and I could certainly say, and I'm going to get, I guess, a little philosophical for a moment, if you wouldn't mind. Sure. I can see, like, from a, I don't want to use the word hedonistic because there's negative connotation, so I'll say Epicurean
Sure.
From an Epicurean standpoint, how that could be a good thing, because it's increasing your well, really your pleasure, right? Which is why people tend to use the word hedonism. Hedonism just now has the connotation of sex, drugs, rock and roll. So, but
Sure,
like Epicureanism, where it's just like it doesn't, and really in increasing your pleasure, it does in a way increase the quality of your life, for sure, right? Having good food, high quality food, being able to have good conversations, being able to have education, all those things, those certainly do improve the quality of your life. And they would be, with the exception of the education one, although you could even argue that too, primarily things that are like more pleasurable, right? Like I said, Epicurean. And I could see that for sure. I don't know that necessarily translates to actual strength in the community, though, nor do I know that it is going to like result in strength in the greater nation as a whole, because the community obviously being the Toronto in that case. And then
in and of itself, you're right. There has to be a buy-in, right?
Right.
So, because you will still find, like I said, Toronto has racial problem, like, Canada has racial problems. So there is there's another very small fringe party called the Canadian Heritage Party. And they're super fringe, and they're like pro-white, pro-Christian, all that other stuff, but even more pro-white than pro-Christian.
A Canadian Heritage kind of sounded a little racist, I'm not gonna lie.
So yeah, because Canadian heritage is, Indigenous people, right? That's the bottom line. But anyway, not to dive too far down that hole.
Well, and yeah,
there
honestly,
has to be a buy-in, right? Like if I don't want to experience those things, like and I didn't grow up this way. My mom was really understanding, and she was, kind of to each his own. She enjoyed these things, and she enjoyed kind of, sticking to her own, but she would venture out and stuff like that. But my dad was Archie Bunker. And if you don't know who that is, you can just do a Google search of him. And there was this TV show called All in the Family. And Archie Bunker was a horrible racist. He said that it's one of those things where you could never, the show All in the Family could never air on television now. Because it was just, it was bad. And that was my dad. He said, I heard him say things growing up that I didn't realize how bad they were. Until I got older, until I got a more diverse group of friends, and until I started, learning more outside of the home. But he said some horrible things that I will never repeat. But he didn't buy in. And so in and of itself, I 100% agree with you. It doesn't create a benefit for country or community unless there's buy-in. If there's buy-in, you cannot lose, because then everybody gets to experience everything, and there has to be buy-in from the other side too, right? So if we're talking about an Ethiopian festival, let's just say, I'm just making stuff up now, but if we're talking about an Ethiopian festival, if I go and enjoy something like that, and I have to buy into that and want to experience that, and when the Canadian festival happens next weekend, they got to buy into that too, right? We have to feed off of each other in that way to get buy-in to experience those things. There's the Village. It's commonly referred to as the Village in Toronto, which is a very large community of non-heterosexuals. So you find homosexuals, bisexual, basically anyone who's not hetero. There's a very large community there. It's called the Village. And I would go down there with friends because, one, there was a cool movie theater in there, and bars and other types of things when I became the legal age to do that kind of stuff. And you got to experience, but there has to be buy-in from these other communities. So just to say it for a third time, just to be perfectly clear, in and of itself, I agree with you. I don't think that degree of diversity in and of itself does anything for us. It gives us opportunity, But if we don't buy in, I don't think it does much. Once you buy in, though, the sky's the limit.
Well, and to an extent, I guess the overall statement, if I drop the insult, which was stupid, and just say diversity is meaningless, it almost seems like in and of itself you agree with me. Is that fair to say, or am I going a little too far?
You might be going a little bit too far, because you would have to, because you would have to exclude, like you would have to take it down. I suppose that if you wanted to break it down to the absolute lowest common denominator, sure, I agree with you. But none of us live there. We don't exist there. We all exist in levels above that. So, so it's like, what's that saying I've started to accept more, is that words don't necessarily have meanings, they have usages, and a lot of words are polysemous. So yeah, in and of itself, it may not have any meaning, but we don't live in that world, right? We live outside of that, in layers above that. And that's where the magic happens. And that's where, you can have all the good things. And sadly, that also means you can have all the bad things. Is diversity the cure to all the cultural things that ail us? Maybe. It might be. If so much of the things we're afraid of are the things we don't understand. So we see people or groups that are different from us, and we don't necessarily understand them. They speak a different language. They dress funny. What's that music they're listening to? That's different from our stuff. But when you buy into those things and you experience those things, like you still, I mean, who's kidding who? If you look at my Apple Music playlist, it doesn't have a massive degree of diversity from, African culture, right? Mm. The closest I get is Jamiroquai. But that doesn't mean that, you don't experience it, a little bit of it. So when we start to break down some of those barriers, first, the people, that look different, right? But we're all just, the difference between, to use the two examples you used before of Jill, who I've never actually, I understand he is Black, but I've never actually seen his face. But Leo I have, right? Mm. The difference between Leo and I are, assuming that he's, straight cis male like I am, is melanin, right? That's the difference between us.
Right. I'd agree with that completely too. So, and I do want to, I think, address some, because I agree with you in almost idealistically, but not pragmatically. Let me kind of explain what I mean. Like when you say like we don't live in that world, right? Mm. It's like, honestly, I think that is probably true of you and the people you know. It's true of me and the people I know. In other words, I'm saying I don't think you're lying or that you're misrepresenting your experience. You know what I mean? Yeah. But honestly, I don't know if it's the case for a lot of people. I think, like, so just as an example, when you have, and this is, I don't know if this is a huge deal in Canada, with the Democratic Party in the United States, or with the left wing in the United States, I should say. Sure. This is a huge, huge thing. This intersectionality of, well, are they a woman? Well, are they Black? Well, are they transgender? Well, are they, you know what I mean? And to where it's like, it's almost like your opinion is irrelevant if you don't meet the criterion, depending on who you're talking to, right? And those tend to be higher echelons, like politicians and media figures. Don't get me wrong, celebrities, stuff like that. But they do live there for sure, right? They live in this world where it's like the diversity by itself is almost like a moral duty and positive, you know what I mean? And it's not necessarily the experiences you can get from it, and it's not necessarily, in fact, I would ask, I guess, because again, you would know more about it than I would, being in Canada. I was about to call it Canada. That's funny. Justin Trudeau, his cabinet, was it taking a cabinet that you would have a equal level of agreement with, if one exists? Was it any better than that? You know what I mean? Or was he just strictly trying to like get brownie points with people, because diversity by itself and in a vacuum was the thing. You know what I mean? Because I think in our higher echelons, that's a really big thing. Unfortunately, I don't think the lay people live there for sure. I think you're right about that.
We can't. I'm not going to pretend to understand his any other person's motives.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say, I left my crystal ball in my other pants. But my hope would be, based on what I know of him. His father was also Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
Okay.
And his son became Prime Minister. After, it wasn't just like, here, son, here's the mantle. It was, his father's been dead for some time. But I would like to think that because of how he was raised and the morals that he was instilled with, that it was out of a genuine desire for real diversity, for all of the benefits that I've mentioned it brings. Could it have been like, I have to admit that it's possible that it was a sham and that it was a photo op. Is that a possibility? Sure. Is it likely? No. And so the other question you kind of asked is does it really make a difference? Yeah, it makes a difference for all of the reasons I mentioned before, because of the richness of the experience of the other people bring to the table. It's like having a potluck dinner, right? If you have 8 white friends that have a potluck dinner, you're going to have hot dogs, hamburgers, beef stew, liver and onions, and a few things like that, right? But if you had a potluck dinner from a multicultural perspective, you might have samosas or shawarma and baklava and all these other different types of things. That is going to give you a difference in richness of experience. So is it a possibility? Sure, I guess it was. I'd have to, if I'm being honest, I have to admit it's possible it was a photo op, but I don't believe that.
Well, and so just real quick, I do want to get a point of agreement, because being somebody who goes to a church, and of course potlucks after church are a big thing. And my church is it's not denominationally Pentecostal, but it's very much like Pentecostals, and so as a result, very ethnically diverse. And I do agree, potlucks there are pretty fantastic, and they definitely always have been, for sure. Because we got some now. Some, don't get me wrong, some of them are ethnically diverse but white. Like we have some Ukrainians and Russians. Sure. There is also some Congolese, some Spanish, Filipino. And I went to a church that was probably 5 times the size when I was a kid, and that it was even greater diversity in that sense, with people from the Caribbean, people from Cuba, from Brazil, things like that. So I definitely see what you mean for sure. As far as like
and so in the same way that they cook different things in the kitchen, right? The conversations around the dinner table will be different, and so when there's that integration of you with this will sound wrong, but I don't mean it to sound wrong. When there's the integration of us and them, right? Or all of them becoming us together, all of those things translate. The richness of the food, also the richness of the experiences, and things like that, because they can tell you of and this I'd be shocked if this didn't happen. But as you were sitting at one of these potlucks with people, that they told you stories about where they didn't grow up in the U.S., where they grew up and what it was like there. Russian, Ukrainian, was it Latvia? Like, because there was some crazy stuff going on there a couple decades ago, and
right.
Or all these different types of things, and all of those experiences they bring with them, and they can look in the same way, like to take it back to the macro level of like a government, they can all look at this through a different set of lenses and say, we've seen stuff like this as well, and we've seen where it can go, and here's a different opinion. Whereas someone who grew up here is just like, I don't understand what's going on here. We need to fix this. Like, it's like the Simpsons things. Like, I haven't tried anything and I'm all out of ideas. So, but there's this where someone else can bring that different experience in and maybe even teach us, definitely teach us something that we didn't know, because we didn't even know we didn't know it.
Right. That's actually, I know people probably don't really like Kent Hovind anymore, but I remember a Kent Hovind a quote that I always thought was really funny. We don't know about the ones that we don't know about. I'm sure he didn't come up with it, but that's where I heard it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't mind Ken Hovind as a person. I just wish he was more honest.
Honestly, I actually have a theory about that. I'll be brief just because I want to get, obviously the whole conversation. But I think that Kent Hovind was legitimately committing tax fraud, but was an honest apologist. Then he got caught for tax fraud. And then after he got out of prison, he just decided to go full blown criminal. Because he's not, I mean, if you watch his debates and conversations and lectures, 2005 compared to 2015, it's night and day. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Ken was on the podcast a couple of years ago.
Oh, for sure. I'll have to check that out, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, we've actually had, not to derail too much, but if anybody watching or listening to this, you can just go to Google the Canadian Atheist. The podcast will come up. It's available on different platforms, and there's always a little intro thing to it. And anytime we've had a Christian on, the language is totally clean, just like when you were on. I think I've actually come closer to bending it on your stream than I did on the podcast when you came on. Out of respect for the people that we have on, I don't, because I've got a mouth. But when I'm talking to people, I try to be respectful. So if you go into the back catalog and you look, like there's been Blake Genta, Kent Hovind, lots of different Christians have come on, even Matt Powell. And I managed to stay clean for him too. So, but if you're interested, have a listen.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I did want to address while we were here is there is a sort of counter of diversity, which is not necessarily people who are against diversity, but people who have a strong want to preserve their own cultural heritage, tradition, preservation, or all that kind of stuff. Now, obviously, sometimes in fact, the reason that I kind of could already guess Canadian Heritage was a white supremacist group is because there are certain buzzwords that people use, right? Like labor typically is a Marxist thing. Heritage does tend to be associated with a lot of racial groups, and specifically even white racial groups, like black racial groups don't tend to say anything about heritage. And so there is certainly that to be said, but there is also, just in the literal use of the word, those who truly want to preserve heritage and tradition, right? And of course, that ends up being the majority of older folks, and probably the majority of people who consider themselves to be culturally conservative, even if they weren't politically conservative or religiously Christian or anything like that. Number one, and I'll just leave this at number one so that you can answer it, and then we'll move on to the other ones. Do you think that is a bad thing? Because in my opinion, that's the base definition of what nationalism is self-determination for us in our group, as well as a nation for us to live and to preserve our heritage in. And I think that's what a lot of people, when they're talking about nationalism or when they're talking about preserving heritage and things that people consider counter to diversity, I really think that's what they mean. I think a perfect example of this is just looking at like the definition of Zionism, right? It's actually just the idea the Jews should have a homeland in Israel. It doesn't even, there's nothing else assumed outside of that about Palestinians, about any, and not to derail the conversation on that, right? But just the point being.
Okay, so, and again, on the face of it, no. Wanting to preserve one's heritage, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's when you want to preserve your heritage at the expense of even allowing others to occupy the same space, right?
Right.
So, like for example, the Satanic Church, right? They wanted the Ten Commandments taken down from a bunch of courts, and they said, you can leave the Ten Commandments up. We just want a statue of Baphomet beside it, right? And you see how quickly the Ten Commandment statues came down, right? Because they didn't, they weren't interested in inclusion, right? And that's, and I didn't mean to necessarily throw the religious thing into it, but you can have, there's nothing wrong with wanting to preserve your heritage. So, I mean, my heritage is Scottish and Welsh, right? When I was getting married, my dad asked me if I was going to wear a kilt. I'm like, are you out of your mind? And I said, you've got a better chance of me wrapping a Canadian flag around my butt than wearing a kilt. I'm like, I'm Canadian.
Right.
So, but there's nothing wrong with wanting to preserve. And there's all kinds of that. Like within a 5-minute drive of where I am, there's a Portuguese social club. Right. And there's all these, and that's just down the street from a Royal Canadian Legion. Right. And so there's nothing wrong with wanting to preserve your heritage, but it's when you want to preserve your heritage by excluding other heritages or cultures from having a seat at the table or being able to express theirs. Right. Canada, like, and this is something that from my perspective, when you went to America, you became American.
Right.
But Canada, is this, so US being more of a melting pot, whereas Canada was more of we just expanded the buffet table, right? We just extended the table and everybody has a seat at the table. And we welcome you to take part in what we do and what we enjoy. And we'd also like to take part in what you enjoy, right? And there are limitations to that. And I've experienced some of those limitations. For example, I love going to different churches. I go to churches all the time. One of my favorites is not too far from me. It's Calvary Baptist Church. And I'll admit freely, it's a little bit of a guilty pleasure because they kind of holy roll all up and down the aisles. And it's a little bit of Schadenfreude for me. Because I get it. But once upon a time, many years ago, I went to a synagogue in Toronto, Beth Tikva. I still remember the name of it and where it was. And I went in and I sat down and I was just dressed. I wasn't even wearing a shirt, as my shirt says God is not great. I have a different shirt for almost every day. But I was dressed very conservatively. I just sat there and I was just looking around and kind of observing what was going on. And I had 2 gentlemen walk up to me and they said, we're going to have to ask you to leave. Like, what? You're making people very uncomfortable. Like, I haven't said anything. I haven't said a word. These are the first words I'm saying. No, you got to get out of here. And I stood up and like, thank you for making me feel so welcome. And I left. I can contrast that with the most welcome I've ever felt was when a friend of mine, Mohammed, before he moved out west, he took me to his mosque. Never have I felt more welcome. This man who he was 90 if he was a day, and he walked up to me with this beaming smile, and he was a very small, frail man, and he put his hand out and he took my hand in both of his, and he said, I have no idea what he said because he said it in a different language. I didn't understand, but he was smiling the whole time and then patted me on the shoulder, just welcomed me. The imam was incredibly welcoming. A little less later on when he found out I was an atheist, but it was like very welcoming environment. So you can preserve your own culture, but I think it's dangerous if you do that at the exclusion of everybody else's. Like it's wrong to say no because this is America, and it's also wrong to say no because this is Canada, because that's like, North America, we are a land of immigrants. Right? I'm only first generation Canadian. My mom was not born in Canada. My dad was born here, but my mom was born in Wales. And when I tell people I'm only first generation, they're like, really? I'm like, yeah. Like there are other people that I know that many more generations than I have invested in this country. So I don't think you can be exclusionary. So yeah, like keep your cultural stuff, cool, but allow people to maybe people want to learn about that. Mm-hmm. Let them enjoy that, and maybe dive into theirs a little bit too. And who knows? You may turn around and say, no, that's not for me. I'm not into that, right? I'm not going to go back to the Hindu temple. Okay, mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. But you may find something. You may learn something, experience something, make new friends. But it's if you do nothing, nothing's going to change.
And so I definitely do see what you mean. I want to, I guess, kind of push to see where that boundary is, I guess, in your mind. So, okay. For example,
give me a couple of examples.
And all of these will be real world examples,
sure,
just to make it more like poignant. So Ireland describes itself as an Irish state. Meaning, first and foremost, it is a state for the preservation and safety and liberty of Irish people. Now, Ireland traditionally has had a problem with at least one group, British, but it hasn't really had a big problem with other groups. So they're not necessarily exclusionary. There's obviously a beef between Britain and Ireland, so that's obviously different. But they're not necessarily exclusionary to other people, but they define themselves very strictly as a state for Irish people, first and foremost. Would that be problematic in your view?
Oh, there's a couple of people that pop in my head right now that would be way better to talk to you about this than me. So on the face of it, I see a problem. And like if it is exclusionary in some way, I have a problem with it. Like I would never join a country club where admittance is restricted based on some criteria. I'm not interested in that. That type of elitist stuff doesn't interest me in any way, shape, or form. So it's when something is exclusionary that I have a problem with. And I would go as far as to say if there was a black, like a black X group, whatever that is, and I was not, and the only reason why I wasn't allowed to participate in anything was because I was white, that would bug me too. Because I want to experience, right? Now there are probably very good reasons why, I wouldn't be included in something like that. Like maybe it's, out of, maybe there are members there that have had horrible experiences. And there's a safety concern, or legitimate fear. I get that. And I'd have to suck that up and get over it. Right. If there was a group that was, only for gay people or only for transgender people, it would bug me that I can't take part in it, but it's only because I'd want to learn and I'd want to present myself as an ally. And there'd be reasons why I wouldn't be able to take part in those, and I'd have to suck it up. Like, do I see a problem with it? Personally, yes, because of what I want, because I'm coming at it from a harmless, I want to help, I want to be involved, I want to learn. But there's the reason why I can't go down like half an hour from where I am. There's an abused women's shelter. Mm-hmm. I can't go volunteer there as much as I'd like to help. I can't. Right. And we all understand why I wouldn't be allowed in the doors. Right. Right.
I certainly understand that.
And I'm not 100%. I don't want it to seem like I dodged the question, but I tried to be as honest as possible in my responses.
No, and I do. I understand, because the reason I asked the question is because it is a difficult one. It really is. Because now let me just kind of tell you where I come from. There's not a term yet for what I would consider myself, but there is a phrase that I've come up with, which is that I am a nationalist for all nations. So in other words, I believe that we are most peaceful. I don't buy the concept of peace is truly possible. Like, I think I can have peace with you, Canada can have peace with the United States, but can everybody be at peace all the time? It just doesn't appear to me that humans are that way, but neither here nor there. But I do think we work better when groups with distinct cultural heritages are able to determine their own cultural path. So as an example, I would be pretty strongly Zionist. I think that the Israelis deserve to have a homeland. And on the flip side of that, and this comes as a shock to a lot of my conservative friends, but I think that the least we could do to Native Americans is offer like, for example, Alaska or Montana or the Dakotas as a nation and say, you guys don't have to leave. Don't get me wrong. But if you would like a state so you can determine your own cultural pathways, we will give one to you. I also believe Hawaii should be returned to its people. And like straight up set up the Hawaiian monarchy if that's what they want again, or even the parliamentary system if that's what they don't want, right? Like that's always been my view. And I understand I'm even relatively radical on that because, like I said, majority of my fellow conservatives would look at me with like stunned that I would give away Alaska and Hawaii to indigenous peoples. But where do we go? Say again?
Where do we go?
Well, so if that sort of thing, it would be a very complicated question for sure. If the sort of thing were to be worked out, first off, it would have to be an awful lot like what does go on in the Middle East, where we can't expect you to get everything that your culture had in the past back, because unfortunately the conquerors did what they did hundreds of years ago and their descendants had nothing to do with anything, right? In other words, Idaho is just as much my home as it is the Nez Perce home at this point, and I had nothing to do with that, right?
So I'm sorry. I think I asked a clumsy question. What I meant to say was, and I guess there's a question in it as well. But I don't want to believe that you're suggesting everyone who's other goes back to where they came from.
No. What I'm saying is that, and that is a good distinction to make. What I'm saying is that I believe it would be better for ethnic groups that have their own distinct cultural heritage, like Native Americans or like the Israelis or like the Irish, right? If they had a state that could determine that they could be self-determined in. And to give the way that I put it always is like, so if we have the Native American example, right? Mm-hmm. And I knew two Nez Perce people, and one of them was like, yeah, no, I love this idea. I want a Native American nation. I'm moving to Alaska, or whatever state ended up being given, or what territory, right? However it worked out. And the other one said, well, I really like Idaho. And also, just for the record, this is where my culture originally was. And also, I kind of like my friends, my white and Hispanic and black friends who I live with here, right? So I'm going to stay here. I think that would be perfectly fine, right? There's absolutely nothing, and especially in the United States, because the United States doesn't have a ethnic identity. I know a lot of people would like us to, but we simply do not. That's just a fact. I think we're a civic identity, really, and I think Canada's similar in that sense. But I just think these people should have the right, just as I have the right as an American, being in this civic national state, to have their own self-determination. You know what I mean? To be able to govern themselves, really.
Isn't that what everybody does now?
In a way.
So for example, we have, like within our parliamentary system, right, we elect officials, right? It seems the problem I see inherent in what you're suggesting, and I'm not suggesting that you are trying to localize groups of people by ethnicity or color. But I think the problem inherent in that is that would be the byproduct of it. That's what would happen. You would see these areas where everyone would congregate, and then it would become exclusionary. And then it would be, no, this is our space. You go back to where you belong. That's the danger, I think, inherent in what it is that that would be proposing, and that could be really bad.
Well, and let me be straight, if that were to be the end result, like if I had like a crystal ball and I could see that as the end result, I would definitely like abandon this in a heartbeat, right? I'm not trying to cause any ethnic divisions.
I don't think that you are, but I think that's one of the dangers, right? Because like you said, and like I agreed to, there's no problem with a group of people wanting to preserve their heritage. There's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. But you would find, nobody gets extreme like extremists. So right. you would have these extremists that would lump together in these areas, and that would become exclusionary. And I'm not saying that it would just be white people. I don't believe that for a moment. I think you would find because you can find extremists I think in any group you can find them. And I don't think it would be too long before, that there was churning within those groups, and they started, setting up these areas and stuff like that. No, this is our space. You've got your space, just like I have my space. Now get out of my space, right? And that's the biggest danger I see in what you're proposing, or not necessarily. I'm not saying this is what you would do if you could do it, but this idea, I think that's a real danger.
Well, so let me kind of, I guess I have a little bit of a counter, because I see I see where you're seeing the problem there, right? For sure. Like I don't want to pretend that it's an unreasonable thing to say, for sure, because it's definitely not. But you do have nations like Israel or Ireland, which are like kind of cultural heritages for their people, and yet we don't like force Irish and Jewish people out of the States or out of Canada, right? Like just because you guys have a place doesn't mean we're forcing you to leave this. Now that might be different on the other end. I guess in Israel there does seem to be it's a minority, but there is certainly an extreme Haredi, which is the ultra-Orthodox group that is not just ethnically exclusionary, but they're really not a big fan of Karaite, Messianic, Reform, Conservative, secular Jews, right? Which is all religious distinctions. But they are a small minority of the country. I think they typically are able, because parliamentary systems, as you would probably know better than I would, tend to have a lot more diversity in parties. Like once you get to the smaller ends, there's like 8 or 9 parties with 1 to 3 seats. At least in Israel, that's the case. And
you're able to, okay, but so, I mean, even with all these areas, and I didn't mean to derail you there, but so like with Ireland, for example, right? But I don't think there's any restriction in, like, if you wanted to immigrate to Ireland, I don't believe there's any restriction for you. And you're not Irish, right? And I don't think there's be any restriction for me. And I'm not Irish. I guess I'm closer. I don't know what your family's descent is. It's European of some flavor, right. I imagine. But if there were situations, like if it was the case, and there's guys from, you're familiar with Cider and Port?
Yeah.
Stephen and Kevin, right? They should be discussing Ireland right now. But if there was, if in some way there was a restriction that this Irish nationalist, as you put it, and I don't know that it's the case, but if there was a situation where no, we're actually, we're trying to keep it kind of just Irish, I would have a huge problem with that too. And if I chose to immigrate to Israel, and they're like, yeah, we're not taking Canadians. Sorry, we're certainly not taking like pasty white Canadians. That's not happening. I'd have a problem with that too, for the same reasons for the same problems that I would see, with this, kind of groups of areas within the continental United States. I'd see the same problems elsewhere, right? Because then I'm backpacking my way through the Middle East, right? When I go to cross the border, well, I have to show my passport. Obviously, it's like, well, you're not staying here, are you? Because we're okay if you go through, but we don't really like your kind here. You have a place, right? Why don't you go back to your place? These are the problems that I see.
Yeah, and like I said, I can certainly see that where some concern does lie there, and I even would see with, like I said, with Israel, there is a minority there that is certainly like that, where they're, this is a Jewish state, so go somewhere else, Sure. But it isn't the majority of the country. And again, Ireland, I know Ireland is defined as an Irish state. I'm not. I'm probably, other than that though, just as familiar with Irish politics as you are. So I won't go too deep on that one. I am curious though, just because in that a question came to mind. And it looks like we are at about an hour and a half, so maybe this will be sort of a good wind down question.
Sure, yeah.
Do you believe it is ever necessary for cultures to separate? The example that immediately comes to mind for me would be like the Islamic Swedish thing that a lot of people talk about, right? Where people say there's such an influx of Islamic immigrants in Sweden that the culture is fighting with it, basically. Not
just Sweden, France as well. France is massively as
mm-hmm.
well. It's estimated that France will be a majority Muslim country within 20 years.
Right. So and that for a lot of people, especially if if it's people who are very serious with their Islam or fundamentalist, I guess I'll say.
Sure.
That could be scary for people, right? Because we're at a point where it's like, okay, now somebody like me might believe that it's good for women and men to dress modestly, but somebody like a Wahhabist is, well, if you're not wearing a literal burqa, I'm going to stone you. You know what I mean? It's like vastly different.
Well, look at Charlie Hebdo from a few years ago.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, like, do you think that it's ever a good thing for somebody to, like, basically just say that we need to have a separation there? And again, that's something that's obviously a European problem. That's not something that's happening with either of us here, but
it's a human problem. Not by force. So for the same reason why, clearly, the one thing that in any discussion, like in any of the discussions we've had so far, that hasn't become a headbutting thing yet, is that you're a fundamentalist Christian and I'm an atheist. And I've said before, for any of your listeners who aren't familiar with me, and I wouldn't expect most of them would be, but I take the positive philosophical position. God does not exist. And that's the stance that I take, and I can defend that position, and we'll have another discussion about that for sure. But I'm not interested in doing anything forcefully. And maybe that's the Canadian in me. There's this whole thing of, like we're not police, we're peacekeepers. So I'm not interested in doing anything by force. So in the same way where I would never, even if I had the power politically to ban religion, even though I think it's a blight on society, I would never do it. I would never want to take away anyone's rights like that. I would rather, because I certainly don't have the power to deconvert anybody. That's, people have to do that for themselves. I can give them some information. We can have discussions, but I don't have that kind of power. And I wouldn't want to have that type of power to divide people. What I would hope to do is I would hope to have discussions, establish discourse in the hopes to find common ground where people can coexist. And that's really hard, because as it stands right now, we're not doing a good job of coexisting. Whether it be religious fundamentalists of different varieties, or people, who have this horrible idea that just because a person's skin is a different color, they're somehow less than or bad. We're not doing a great job of coexisting right now. So we do have a lot of work to do. But I guess to most directly answer your question, do I ever see a need? The only time that I would ever say we need to change something is when people's lives are at risk. I still wouldn't want to force the issue. I would never want to close borders, except when we have a pandemic like we do now. Because we need to control that, because that doesn't care what color your skin is. It's just going to hurt you regardless of what you are. But I wouldn't want to close borders. I wouldn't want to restrict access and things like that. I would want to open things up and have dialogues and educate people and come to common ground that way. And I say that fully accepting and understanding that when we're talking about extremists, because we've both referenced them, that's really hard to do. Because it's really hard to break in, and I mean metaphorically speaking, to break in when you're talking about someone who is a hardcore fundamentalist, regardless of their flavor of fundamentalism. So I guess the most direct answer to your question is no. I still wouldn't want to. I still wouldn't want to do that. I would want to find other ways.
Well, and that is it's a interesting, and I don't know. It's I don't. It is interesting that I don't see problem so much with like the reasons necessarily as much as like conclusions sometimes, and I think that tends to be a typical thing a lot of times. But there is obviously, I'm a very pacifistic and also very limited government kind of guy. So in a lot of ways, I sympathize with a lot of that, the lack of force, all that kind of stuff. And then in other ways, there is also the, like I said, I do have sort of a idea of wanting to preserve the cultures. And with the United States, of course, the culture that I would preserve wouldn't be an ethnic or a religious or a racial one, but a civic one, right? The culture of the Constitution and freedom.
Sure.
I had another thought that I actually wanted to get on with that, but I guess I kind of lost it. So I'm not.
Okay. Yeah.
But no,
take a deep breath and see if it comes back to you.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. I still think I still think you and I are struggling for areas of disagreement. Because I think when we iron things out, we understand that. I mean, it's one of the things that I find interesting about talking to you is that our starting points could not be more different.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we're still able to find some degree of common ground. And even when we disagree, neither one of us is too pig-headed to accept the fact that there's different ways of looking at things.
Yeah, I do. I think that is actually a very interesting thing, especially since I'll just be kind of, honest as far as before I had ever actually met you. My perception of you from other people had always been that he's like one of the ones who's really going to try and get on your nerves. He likes to to press buttons, and all that kind of. And I've never experienced that.
I push buttons in. I think my first language actually is sarcasm, and English is a close second. So, and I will push buttons when it is appropriate. I have an idea of whom you may be referencing, and yeah, there are times when I do that, but it is usually met like for like. I am. I'd like to think I'm not the first person that goes there, but I will. Yeah, I will always stand my ground, and it's entirely possible. Well, maybe it's not so possible because what I was about to say was, the further we get into disagreement and when we actually have a discussion on worldviews, because we haven't done that yet. Mm-hmm. When we actually do have a discussion on worldviews, that's where some of it may come out. But I think we've already built a solid enough foundation of mutual respect where I don't think it'll go there.
I actually tend to feel that way also. And it's similar to the way I kind of got me and Skylar Fiction are sort of on that level now, where we just like, I mean, and it's not like it won't get, animated or passionate or anything like that, but just have like a mutual respect there. So I think that'll be likewise. Honestly, there are certainly, and of course you would be able to name the Christian ones better than me, but I could obviously name the atheist ones. There are atheists out there where it's just like, I'm not really interested in talking to you. You're sort of the cliche internet atheist, but it's not like it's the hugely overwhelming majority of speakers. You know what I mean? Yeah, and I think sorry, I was just going to briefly say, like I was going to say, I'm sure you would even have more experience with the Christian ones than I would too. So I'm sure that goes both ways pretty solidly.
I've had back and forth with some interesting people. But I've never, there's only been one person. There are only two people. And calling that, like, if I was to refer to you as an apologist, I mean, someone who argues for the faith, right? You could only call them apologists because they self-identify that way. But there are only two people who are absolutely, perhaps, like, that I would say I am more Christian than, to whom I would never again converse with. Like, that just aren't worth the time and energy.
Right.
And anybody else, maybe three, yeah, that I would not converse with again. And everybody else will be like, well, we can try it again. Let's just toss some names out there. John Maddox and I have not had a great time together.
Right.
But if, pardon me, if opportunity presented itself where in a neutral forum, we could kind of take things back down to a base level and maybe start over, I'd entertain speaking with him. I debated Darth Dawkins. I wish he would stop using up my oxygen. He is a waste. I debated Mr. Batman. Same thing. And the other one who I would not have the time for is Smokey Saint, who I think for other reasons, that isn't so much a problem anymore. But he also took things to a completely base level where it was more about attack. He couldn't refute the argument, so he just went after me, which is something I won't do with someone. Like it doesn't matter, who you are. Like, I mean, you're a younger guy, but when we do have that conversation, that's not what I'm not gonna focus on the fact that you're just a young guy and how could you possibly know anything.
Right.
Right. Because as we've talked about before, and that what you've read far exceeds mine. Like you are more well read than I am. So I would never dream of saying something like that because you don't know people based on that. And it's also the low hanging fruit, right? Mm-hmm. Like, don't attack it's the same as when you argue by memes, right? You toss a meme out there when you've got nothing. I don't have anything intelligent to say, so I'll just throw a meme out there.
Right.
And it just shows that you're really base level, in my humble opinion.
No, I definitely do. I definitely do see that.
Did I name the person? Did I name the person you were referring?
Two of them, actually.
Oh, okay.
Smokey and John Maddox. Now, me and John Maddox get along quite well. But and to be fair, it's not that I don't get along with Smokey, but I am probably the most vocally critical Christian of Smokey. And for whatever reason, that just does not actually get his goat the way it does when other people criticism. I don't really know why. I don't know if he just doesn't feel I'm worth his time, or if he has some kind of respect for me, or maybe he even thinks there's some truth to what I say. I have no idea. But you'd be hard pressed to find a Christian who's more critical of Smokey Saint than I am. Maybe Sister Sunshine, but I don't know that she even does stuff anymore.
I'm not familiar with her.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's two of the people who I had heard that, not particularly good, which is fine. I mean, everybody's going to have their own things. I, for a long time, was able to have solid conversations with the Raging Atheist. The last 3 have not actually worked out that way. So maybe that time is over, but
so maybe we should go there too. So, I found this very interesting. So last night, so I watched some of his conversations with Matt Powell leading up to the discussion that Dean and I, I should also say the podcast I do is not just me. It's with my very good friend, Dean, who CJ knows. But anyway, leading up to our conversation with Matt Powell, I looked at some of his videos and his confrontations with the Raging Atheist were among some of the ones that I had seen. So I watched them. As a result, and you know how YouTube algorithms work, right? Once you watch a video, it just keeps suggesting. Yeah. So last night, I consume entirely too much YouTube. Last night I went on, and the Raging Atheist had a video saying confronting CJ. So I'm like, cool, because in my mind, you would be there. If I say I'm confronting someone, well, in my world, that means I'm talking to the person. So I went on, and he was reviewing a video. When it turns out he was reviewing a video. So I saw the side chat, and I'm looking for you because I had to remind myself to look for TheCynicogue, not CJ Cox. I'm like scrolling. I don't see. And then it took a while. I'm like, hey, I messaged a couple people in the chat saying, where's CJ? Like, I don't see him. I didn't see you as a chat bubble anywhere. And nobody was paying attention to me, which is fine. I get ignored mostly by my wife, but I was getting ignored. So, and I'm kidding, of course, but I'm finally like, hey, moderator guys, where's CJ? And then somebody finally came on and said, he's not here. I'm like, I don't understand the video. The video says confronting CJ. If he's not here, you're not confronting him. And then I left. Like because I was curious to see what I wanted to see what the confrontation was about. And I didn't watch enough of the video to really get the content of it because I was busy searching the side chat to see what was going on. I've never spoken with the Raging Atheist. I've only watched his stuff a little bit. He's not my cup of tea, even as an atheist. Yeah, I don't imagine I don't think we'd argue about anything, but I don't think we'd get on particularly well either. Anyway, that's a story I want to share about last night.
No, and it's like I said, we did for a while. Really what happened is that I was surprised that he was surprised that this was my view, but I made a comment on one of his streams about being terming myself radically pro-life, and just like ever since then, it's just been downhill, And the thing that was like, I understand if you feel that that's wrong, but I just don't understand why he was shot. It's like, you understand that I am a fundamentalist. And the thing is, at the time, he understood better than probably any other atheist on YouTube, because I've had like 14, 15 conversations with the Rage.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know. It just sort of was like, is that actually surprising to you? But now he's on this thing. Like, he's like, I guess I'm just as bad as Matt Powell and blah, 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 whatever. So we'll see what happens, Well,
I mean, it's interesting. And again, maybe when we actually have that conversation, we'll come to some areas of disagreement. But it was interesting because when we were on SJ's channel a few weeks ago, was it a month ago? I don't know. Anyway, a while ago, it was pretty straightforward. You self-identify as a fundamentalist Christian. I understand what a fundamentalist Christian means. I found, honestly, like I said on the podcast, I'm like, it was kind of funny for me to kind of spark this fire and watch you go at it with Rob and stuff like that. Cause I'm like, I'm just gonna let the Christians argue. But I understand what it means to be a fundamentalist Christian. I mean, yeah, I think you're wrong. But I'm still not going to necessarily attack you for that. Matt Powell, I found a little bit different. And the reason I say that is because it was, I guess it's hard for me to put the finger. So maybe I shouldn't comment on it because it's hard for me to exactly put a finger on, but for whatever reason, even though he would identify probably as fundamentalist as you do, I view the two of you in a different light. I think like I said, I think you're both wrong, but I think he's dishonest about it. Like in the same way that I think, like people like Kent Hovind, right? I believe Kent Hovind is dishonest. Mm-hmm. But there are lots of Christians that I've spoken to SJ. I don't think SJ's dishonest. I think she's wrong, but I don't think she's dishonest about it. And I view you in the same light, whereas I view people like Matt Powell as dishonest in their approach and their argumentation.
Yeah, and I would just say kind of briefly, I do think one of the biggest reasons why we would probably be set by people in a different camp, even, not even just you, but even some others as well, honestly has to boil down to the NIFB distinction. I think the NIFB has sort of co-opted the term fundamentalist. Mm-hmm. But, it is interesting. Fundamentalist, it just means that you adhere to the fundamentals. It also seemingly implies literalism, both of which would be true in my case. And while that certainly would mean there'd be areas of sometimes even strong disagreement, like, for example, things like whether or not sexual liberation is a good thing or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. In the end, the original fundamentalists were still, William Jennings Bryan, Billy Sunday, Billy Graham, people like that, you know what I mean? People who were like still they were kind-hearted and sweet and charitable and all that, because that's one of the fundamentals of the Christian faith. And so the NIFB, when they have this idea of like, no, we should have a government that's executing homosexuals and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. You and I would part company if that's what you said you wanted to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the thing is too, is I can say definitively, I don't think that Jesus would say the same. I think there's a purpose of the law that Paul clearly explains as a taskmaster. And that would, we would get into a huge conversation about this, but the point just being that, I don't believe we should execute adulterers either, even though I find it to be wrong, right? I don't believe that we should execute people who curse their parents, even though I find it to be wrong. I think that the law was meant to make a point, and when you apply that in the modern day to say like the government should execute X, Y, and Z, I mean, Steven Anderson and Matt Powell would be on the chopping block for sure. Like we all know that because most of us would.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like I use it as an example. Like when I'm talking about extreme fundamentalisms, Steven Anderson is my go-to. Mm-hmm. He has, and I'm sure a lot of your subscribers would be aware of his famous piece of the sermon where he's standing at the pulpit and he has that Staples button, that was easy button.
Yeah.
And he has it up there and he says, if I could push this button, and every time he said something horrible I won't say. He said, but every time I push this, a homosexual person would die. He said, I'd push it till my finger broke. Mm-hmm. And I was so appalled by someone like that in my mind. And it's hard because people say, well, you can't judge. And well, yeah, I can. I think that disqualifies you from calling yourself a Christian.
It does, straight up. And it is interesting because I am I'm arguably, and I don't even claim this in braggadociousness. I just claim it because this is what other atheists have told me, like The Rage and Skylar Fiction and stuff like that. I might be the most fundamentalist Christian on YouTube right now.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that's not 100%, but that's possible, right? With some of the debates, especially with when it comes to like my opinions on things like biblical slavery and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. Even people like James White don't tend to go there. Again, might. That's what other atheists have told me, not not me projecting on myself. So that's an asterisk. But with that said, I completely agree with you. It's like it's literally you are outside of the Christian faith. You can't believe that Paul, an executor of Christians, and Mary Magdalene, a prostitute, and Matthew, a tax collector, which means basically a traitor because tax collectors are collecting for the Roman Empire, right? And all these people, like you can't say that he was willing to save all those people, but those gay people, and I mean, it's just like that's absurdity.
Yeah, so I think that there's definitely I think if anything we have unearthed topics for further discussions.
Yeah, for sure. And I did notice we are now at about hour and roughly 48 minutes. It'll be 48 minutes and 10 seconds. I also noticed that my camera turned off again. I got to actually plug in. I'm using my computer camera.
Okay.
I got to plug in my actual digital camera because it doesn't do this.
Does it go to sleep after a while? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I have a HD camera that is not only works perfectly fine, but it looks a lot better too. It looks a lot like
this is just my MacBook. Like we're a Mac family, so like I have an iMac in the basement downstairs, and I use this MacBook really only for like I have the podcast. My wife also has one as well, and it's this really the only thing. Like this studio is podcast studio / my snake room, so that's all we use it for. And because it's set up like as FaceTime, it purposely will not go to sleep. Like if I get up and walk away, and 3 hours later, still be running until the battery, unless I plug it in, the battery dies.
I'll bet I could probably go into the settings actually and make mine do that.
Oh, I'm sure you could do that. I'm sure you could turn that or turn it to 2 hours or to 4 hours or whatever it is. But yeah, no. So I think we've definitely. I think we've definitely unearthed some topics for some more discussions for sure. And you know, some people will watch this and they'll either dog you about it or they'll dog me about it, and it is not possible for me to care less. I have conversations with all kinds of different people, and it's just that's what I do. And if you don't like it, okay, I don't care.
Well, let me say this, you know, not to toot your horn or anything, but I have had conversations with many atheists at this point. You're on a list of 3 of the ones who like I actually really, really genuinely enjoy talking to. Potentially 4. I haven't talked to Jim Majors enough to add him yet, but I do really like Jim. He's a cool dude.
Yeah, I got to reach out to Jim to have. So we did that tag team, right?
Mm-hmm.
I got to reach out to Jim to try to get it. I don't want to bug him because I know he's a doctoral student as well, so he's probably psychotically busy.
Right.
But I do want to have him. I do want to have him on the podcast as well, and I'd love to have you back as well. But yeah, I think it's just like I said, and it's hard too, right? Because like if you think about, you had said that you spoke to Smokey and Maddox about me, right? And the hard part is that we did 3. Steven and I did 3 tag teams with them, right? The first on God, you know, the second on the Christian God, and then on morality, right? So, and it was, and I understand the way debates are set up, right? So it was really easy for animosity to grow when you're taking these hyper positions on opposite sides of the field. Whereas when you just, you know, when you just have, you know, just having a discussion with someone, it would, like, one of us, like, in order for me to take a really aggressive stance with you, you'd have to say something overtly hateful or bigoted or something like that for me to say, like, whoa. And then from there, I would ratchet up. Right. So, and I don't even think that's going to happen anyway. So, you know, were you and I to engage in a debate, would it be a little bit more adversarial? Of course it would be.
Right.
It would be a debate. Exactly. Right. You know, whereas this is even just a discussion where, again, I say we struggled for areas of disagreement. It was more nuanced disagreement than you're wrong.
Well, and I think that's good too, because, you know, the thing about a lot of this is, I mean, I don't know how long the Canadian Atheist podcast has been up, but if it's you said 133 episodes, right?
For almost 4 years.
Almost 4 years. Yeah, and so, you know, that means you still have plenty of time to, like, potentially have a boom, which, I mean, I don't even know if you haven't had yet, to be honest, because I don't know the podcasting world too well. I'm mostly on YouTube.
So it's interesting. We got super lucky, if you're okay with me sharing.
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
So about 6 months into it, so about 3.5 years or so ago, there was a conference that came to Toronto called Imagine No Religion. And I was really excited because it was always held in British Columbia. But for the first time, it was going to be held in Toronto, and I was super stoked. And Armin Navabi, who's the head of Atheist Republic, which is the largest atheist Facebook community in the world, he was there. And he and I connected. He came on the podcast, and he blasted our podcast episode out to his worldwide audience. And as a result, we now last year was horrible because we were very lazy, but we still enjoy downloads from more than 100 countries. And we average in the neighborhood on the low side of about 35-ish hundred to on the high side about 8,000 downloads per episode.
Nice. That is solid, actually.
Now, we've been very lucky to have some great people on. Like, I mean, we've had Lawrence Krauss on the podcast. Aaron Raw has been on a couple of times. David Fitzgerald.
David Fitzgerald. He's a cool dude.
What's that?
I said I actually debated David. He's a good dude.
Yeah, David's awesome. And but what's funny is Saitan Brugenkate holds the record for the highest amount of downloads per episode. He even beat Lawrence Krauss.
Nice. You know what's funny about that is Saitan Bruggencade is like his most popular videos are almost always like on atheist channels. It seems like I don't think he even had his own channel, if I'm not mistaken, because I know he quit just a little bit ago.
Yep. And I just, as a person, I hope he's okay. I don't know enough of the details about what happened, and there's very little information out there.
Right.
I just, as a human, I hope he's okay, and I hope whatever is alleged to have happened didn't happen. Because if it happened, that meant there's somebody that got hurt, and I don't want that to happen. But a funny story about Cy. So I had been chirping him to come on the podcast, and we were going to go on Non Sequitur a couple of years ago, and we all know what happened to Non Sequitur. It'll be back, but we know what happened to Non Sec. So Cy finally reached out to me via email, and he's like, listen, he said, I do these things all the time. He said, I'm just in London, Ontario, which is about 2 hours from where I am. He said, we're only 2 hours apart. He said, if this is going to happen, either I'm coming to you or you're coming to me. So I'm like, I got a studio here. He's like, great, I'll come to you. So I gave him my address. He came here. He sat 3 feet from where I am now, and we had a podcast.
Nice.
So he was actually in studio, and his podcast still has the highest number of downloads. I'm sure it's because he sent it out to his audience as well. And it was interesting because Cy's another one of those guys where I do not for a moment believe Cy is being dishonest. He sat 3 feet from me, and as we were talking through this stuff, I watched tears well up in his eyes. Because, he's like, well, I just, I hope, hopeful for you for the future and stuff like that. I'm like, well, because, he's a Calvinist. I'm like, well, it doesn't really matter, does it? My fate's already been decided. It's just whether or not, I'm happen to be shown grace. And I said, and it can't happen for me. And he's like, why not? I said, because according to Mark 3:29, you blaspheme the Holy Spirit. It's an unforgivable sin. I'm like, do you have any idea how many times I've done that? And I watched tears well up in his eyes, because in his mind, I was lost. And it was an incredibly genuine conversation. And so not for a moment do I believe he's dishonest in any way.
Well, and that is kind of a cool story, I guess, and just for the record, as I've said before, I do have, of course, my hope that perhaps there's a misinterpretation of that verse there, but who knows? Yeah. Not that's a different conversation for a different time.
I'm not worried about it.
I know for sure. I know.
I'm not. It's not something I lose any sleep over. But I guess we're encroaching on 2 hours. I'm not sure what kind of time you've got, but
well, it does seem like the conversation is hitting kind of its natural conclusion too. It was definitely a good one. Want to thank you again for coming on here today. The conversation, for those of you who are needing a reminder, because we did just spend actually about 30 minutes talking about other stuff. It was the first hour and a half, though, was on topic, and we were talking about whether or not diversity was a good thing, not as opposed to being a bad thing, but as opposed to being a moot thing. So good. It was a solid conversation. Definitely check it out. Last 30 minutes was pretty solid too. So check out the whole thing if you guys are just showing up. Is there anything else you'd like to actually say before we give like conclusions and stuff?
The only thing I'd like to say is, for anybody, I purposely never have the stream going because I don't want to get pulled away, and I have the attention span of a gnat, so it happens too easily. So if there are people that are watching this now or they're going to watch it later, we love having discussions with Christians. I think I've demonstrated here that I'm safe to talk to. So feel free to send us an email, theca@rogers.com, just THECA@rogers, ROGERS.com. And come on, you can tell your story. We can talk about stuff, pick a topic, and we can have a discussion. The one thing that I said to you, CG, and I think I held up our end of the bargain is you will never be muted. Your conversations will never be edited, and you will have at least 50% of the time to talk. So we value good conversations. If all you want to do is come on and preach, I might let you get away with that for a few minutes, but then I'm going to ask you some tough questions. So,
right.
But but we've had some great guests on. If you go back and look at the back catalog, anything with a Christian is absolutely clean listening, so you can have your kids in the room. Anything else, lock the kids up, because I am one foul-mouthed Canadian. I'll end it there.
Alrighty, and then with that, I will just say to you guys, shalom, and once again, thank you very much for watching this. Not really episode, I guess, just sort of an impromptu broadcast is basically what it was. If you like this kind of content, please do consider liking and sharing and subscribing to this YouTube channel. I, of course, do apologetics content, typically my Unapologetics podcast, as well as Unapologetics like short edited videos, live rooms, and debates. I do have a Watchdog podcast that's political, but it will eventually be moved on to TheCynicogue news channel, so just be looking forward for that if you guys are interested in that as well. Hit that bell, of course, if you want to be notified every single time that I actually have an upload. And remember, we are going to be having an interview with Dr. David Roll next Thursday at 8 a.m. Of course, you don't have to catch it live. It will be here afterwards. And hopefully an interview with Bruce Gore as well, which will be given two different sides, not in debate with each other, but just the different evidences for a conventional chronology exodus and for a new chronology exodus. So those will be solid episodes. Hope to see you guys there. And obviously, David Roll is the biggest person I've talked to so far, so that's obviously very exciting. And of course, I do aim to make this a career. So if any of you guys would like to get this, number one, share it out to all your different social media platforms, Parler, Gab, Twitter, Minds, whatever it is that you use. And also, number two, if you would consider giving to the Patreon, of course, I would certainly appreciate that. Obviously, only do so if you feel that the content is worth it. We don't need more trash content out there. And if my content's not worth it, I definitely don't need your money. And with that, I think that's actually all we got to say. Shalom. Thank you guys very much. God bless you. And we are out of here.